I guess before we really get started, I want to kind of discuss the opposite extremes of the argument here. So the first being there's absolutely no free will. Everything is completely deterministic. Like everything is like predestined, predetermined. Would be like the one extreme, which I don't think anyone's really trying to say. It's kind of interesting though because that's kind of how a lot of stories in like fiction kind of play with this idea of the universe being everything planned out, predetermined, like destiny and all that. It's definitely more of a thing in older stories to the point where we kind of assume that that was kind of the point of view of most people, whether they actually believe that or not, hard to say, whether they understood fiction versus reality. We quite often don't give ancient people as much credit as we should for their intelligence. Difficult to really say for sure what they actually believed at the time. But nowadays, in modern science, we, for the most part, don't believe that to be the case. We have things like quantum mechanics that show that there's a lot of randomness in the universe, things that are not predictable. It does not mean free will, it just means that not everything is predetermined. That would be the one extreme there, would be where everything is sort of mapped out, will always happen this way. So the opposite end would be if every action was based on choice, which we also don't believe to be the case. At least I don't think anyone does. It would be kind of like assuming that free will exists in like subatomic particles. Who knows? Maybe there could be some case you could make for that, but at least to me, it doesn't make any sense. And we can definitely see things, even if we just limit this to like the macro scope of like humans, rather than going full on like subatomic there, and just looking at human actions as all being choice. That clearly also isn't the case because there are things like our basic bodily functions, like you're not forcing your heart to beat through choice, it just happens. We have like basic reflexes that occur, like have your reflexes tested at the doctor. You can be startled, jump, or blink when something happens. These things clearly are not choice, they are basic bodily functions there. So we can pretty easily assume that neither extreme is the case, which means we have to determine where is the line, at what point we consider there to be free will versus not. And that's kind of an interesting subject to talk about, but one that's kind of less scientific, I suppose, as it's more philosophical. What you believe is a point where free will can exist versus doesn't. My goal here isn't to prove or disprove the existence of free will. It's mostly just to foster more discussion on the topic. The video we're going to watch today does a pretty good job of explaining a lot of things. I don't believe that he's quite got enough evidence to actually make these conclusions, basically, based mostly on the points of he's making assumptions that I don't think he believes to be assumptions, where he's just kind of claiming it as a fact rather than something that could still be incorrect. For the most part, it's things that we kind of naturally believe instinctually and such, or at least kind of some of them more societally difficult to really draw a line there sometimes. But given that the subject is free will, which is something we also believe instinctually, it's important to make these distinctions still. And again, the other point being the idea of having free will versus when we're actually exercising it. Because whether or not we have free will, there are still times when we are driven by emotions and instincts and such. Again, even looking specifically at humans, not even looking outside of that, there are definitely times where even if we have free will, we're not exercising it. Yeah, the video we're going to watch today, called The Free Will Illusion by Kyle Hill on YouTube. Highly recommend him if you haven't checked him out before. Yeah, let's get into it.
You feel like you are free. Free to like the color blue more than red. free to cross the street when you want to, free to do your taxes. You feel like you chose to
Hopefully
watch
the
this
volume's
video.
good here.
I disagree. In fact, I don't think you're free at all. I think that free will is an illusion. Not exactly a trick of the mind, but an evolved sense that doesn't reflect the reality of what happens in a human brain. The consequences of this revelation aren't as dire as some make it seem, but I do believe that losing free will may change you. It might make you a more compassionate, moral person. But whether or not this actually happens isn't for me to decide. Or you, for that matter.
The argument against free will, mercifully, is simple. No need for fancy philosophy or religious doctrine or quantum mechanics. I ask you only to follow what I call the great causal chain. That is, if you start where you feel the most free and trace causality as far back as you can, I don't think you'll find any room for the conscious decision-making that defines free will. Think about what you want to have for dinner tonight. This is an easy demonstration of your freedom of will, right? Chicken or salmon, pasta or dumplings, it's all up to you. But when we say you, who do we mean? Well, you are your mind. And the mind is everything your brain is doing at this moment.
So here's the first thing I want to point out, is that he is very clear about the brain as being the self, which is sort of a very common viewpoint. This is the first assumption, though. It may be a societal thing. We give a lot of extra credit to the brain as being all of us, whereas it's just a part of the whole. The mind and the brain are not necessarily the same thing. Again, I'm not a neurology expert or anything. I don't want to say anything special about all this that make you think that I necessarily know what I'm talking about here. But my understanding is that there's even things that we think that we haven't really gotten a place for in the brain, like the sense of self, for instance. I think we don't actually know where that comes from. And we definitely know that there's a lot of things where it's very interconnected between the body and the brain. I actually want to go ahead and watch a little bit longer here before I get into any more about this, though.
Whether you end up at chicken or dumplings, it will be your neurology, your neurotransmitters and how they move about that decides. Now attempt to follow more links on the great causal chain. You chose dinner. Okay. When did you choose your mind that chose dinner? Did you choose the environment your mind developed in? The nutrients it had access to when you were growing up? The pollution it incorporated? The other minds it interacted with? When did you choose the DNA that made your mind in the first place? Or indeed the random mutations that went into that DNA when your parents got together? Who decided how wealthy your family was, where they lived, and when? Going back another link, did your parents have any of the choices in this chain that you did not? Or their parents? Or their parents? And so on. If your thoughts and intentions and actions are the product of your mind, then the mind emerges from the billions of neurons firing in your brain, and your brain developed under a myriad of conditions that it didn't choose. Where is free will? The great causal chain goes all the way back, and I mean all the way back. Back to the first humans, back to the first common ancestor with chimpanzees, back to the first multicellular organisms, back to the first atoms in the universe. To say that you could have decided differently, that you were free to choose that which you didn't, is to say that the first atoms in the universe could have combined differently, that the first organisms on Earth could have evolved differently, that your parents could have met at a different time or place, or not at all, that you could have had a different brain than you have right now. But none of that happened. The universe is what it is. You made the choices you made, and the conscious you had nothing to do with it.
I know.
Okay. Yeah, so again, there's a lot going on there. There's some points like what could have happened versus what did happen. Very much so some quantum mechanics type stuff we could talk about there, but that actually comes up later on, so I'll save that for there. Again, I'm also not an expert in that field, so everything I talk about there will be purely speculative. Not trying to disprove his points here per se, just opening up room for more discussion. The big point he was talking about there is our brains and biology. For the most part, what he's saying, very much so agree with it, except for the idea of the brain as the self. There are so many things we see where our thoughts and emotions are influenced by other factors, the gut-brain connection or something along those lines. Your diet can heavily influence how you think and feel, because we are, again, a full organism, not just a brain. It's actually kind of a more modern take on things to assume that we are the brain. Definitely done a complete 180 since back in ancient times. I've always heard about when the ancient Egyptians would mummify a person, they would remove the organs they thought were important and put them into separate jars, and then they just scramble the brain and just get rid of it because they were like, yeah, this isn't important. Nowadays, we assume that the brain is everything, basically. The important point to note here is that that is an assumption. While that might be the case, that everything going on here is entirely the brain, and that brain chemistry is responsible for every choice we make, it's not necessarily the case. And on top of that, just because we think or feel one way doesn't mean that's how we act. Yeah, for me personally, like, doing this causes like an incredible amount of anxiety for me. Like my brain is telling me, yeah, just don't do this. Like, I don't have to. But despite feeling that way, that I don't want to be here, I still am doing this. I'm choosing to do this. Now, again, is that free will, or is that, again, another part of the biology here, something from my experiences that is pushing me in this direction? Difficult to say, but that's why I'm not necessarily trying to say, like, hey, yes, free will must be a thing. But I do just want to point these things out, that there is still a place where not everything here is so cut and dry, per se. Let's continue with the video
that
now.
you don't feel this way. You don't feel beholden to the electrical thunderstorm in your head, no matter whether or not you had a say in where it came from or its genetic lineage. But I submit to you that this is the free will illusion. An illusion because you actually do feel this way. You just never notice it. With a little attention, you can see that what you feel like is decision-making is actually just post hoc rationalization of cognitive chaos.
If you really do choose your choices, how do those options arrive? Let's take a moment to pay close attention to how your choices actually happen. Close your eyes. I want you to choose a major city, anywhere in the world. Calm your mind and choose a city. A city like Dublin, or Cairo, or New York, or Shanghai, or Caracas, or Kyiv. Some of you are now probably having the sensation of remembering that Dublin exists, and that is now influencing your choice. You initially had an explosion of options in your mind, and now you are thinking about certain parts of the world, but I'll stop interfering. Decided? Good. Now open your eyes. I want you to honestly think about how this process just went. When I asked you to think of a city, many options came to mind. Then, for whatever reason, those options were narrowed down. Why? Sure, you can think of a reason in retrospect. You vacationed in Dublin once, or you have a sister in New York. But be honest, you have no idea why these conditions popped up, do you? Why didn't you think of a city like Christchurch, a place you've always wanted to visit? Why didn't you think of Burundi, a city you've never heard of? You're not free to choose the cities that you don't randomly pop into consciousness, are you? And you're not free to choose the cities that you don't know already. The point of this is to try to find the bottom level of your choices. But even for something as simple as choosing any place in the world, you cannot account for what options you thought of, and cannot account for what factors decided between them. You were not free to choose that which you didn't think of, and at no point did you decide what not to think of. If you're having a hard time with getting to the bottom of your attention like this, try it again with another simple question. Close your eyes and think of a family member. or any model of car, or any number. In every case, you will find that your choices, decisions, and their justifications simply appear in consciousness. Why did you think of your brother? Or a Honda Accord? Or 47,203? Pay close enough attention to the next thought you think, and you will see that you have no more conscious control over it than you have over the next word that I say, or indeed the next word that you hear.
Now use your new
I want to point out here that he's talking specifically about thought, which are, again, a very brain-oriented part, which that I don't think is an assumption, that the brain is the part responsible for creating thought. But thoughts do not necessarily dictate actions or choices. Again, we have a lot of things like intrusive thoughts. These are not a part of what you would consider to be free will. There's a lot of instinctual things we do and think, the way we feel and act. They're all connected for sure, but it's kind of separate from free will in that while we are heavily influenced by our thoughts, we can also choose to ignore them. Again, going back to things about anxiety and like depression, like that's very much so, it influences the way we think and feel. But the way to overcome that is to realize that they're just thoughts and that we have the freedom to ignore them. So our ability to ignore our thoughts is kind of where free will exists, assuming again that it does exist. But again, I'm not here to prove the existence of free will, just to foster the conversation and get the discussion rolling. I think we can continue here now, though.
found attention skills and try to interrogate everything else you feel like you have freedom over. When did you decide to scratch your nose with your left hand instead of your right? When you were hungry, when did you decide you wanted a chicken Caesar salad and not a burger? When did you decide to get angry when you were cut off in traffic? When did you decide to do that extra rep at the gym when you didn't have to? When
And again, kind of the same thing here, where he's talking more about feelings and thoughts rather than actual decisions. Sure, no one's claiming like, oh, I decided to have this craving for this piece of food. You're saying that you chose to give into that craving, or you chose to not give into the craving. I feel like that's an important distinction to make there as well.
did you decide to understand the words that I'm saying to you now?
Think of consciousness like a thunderstorm, with random flashes of lightning seemingly appearing out of nowhere, under no control. Some streaks hit the ground, others reach off into the sky. The cloud doesn't choose which. Your brain is like the thundercloud, a complicated mass of electrons and water producing strong electric signals almost randomly. A flash of intention here, a streak of opinion there, a shock of motor movement somewhere else. Some hit the ground, others don't. In this analogy, what you act on, what you feel like you choose, is no more controlled than where the lightning strikes, when, where, how many times. Now imagine that a thunderstorm was somehow conscious, that there was a feeling of what it was like to be a thundercloud. Knowing what we know about how thunderclouds form, and how lightning strikes, how all of that happens in what geographic locations, at what height off the ground, with what temperature, with what moisture content, with what voltage, across what distance, with what velocity, would you believe a thunderstorm if it told you that it chose to strike a certain place at a certain time?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of go off on a tangent here because I feel this is kind of funny, actually. If a thundercloud had the ability to communicate with humans, and it told me that, I absolutely would believe it. Clearly, if it has rational thought and ability to communicate, then we can pretty much assume that in order for it to speak, it can control its movement. If a sentient, actually a sapient at this point, thundercloud, is giving off lightning, it's either using it to hunt as a defense mechanism or as a waste product. So, I mean, if it's using it to hunt, then clearly it's going to be able to choose where it's sending these lightning bolts. If it's a defense mechanism, it wants to have at least some control over it. And if it's waste, that's the one case where it wouldn't need to. But if we think about it like in humans, we can control to some extent how long we can wait before having to excrete our waste. So if the cloud can move freely and can at least control how long until it gives off its lightning, then since this is a natural bodily function of this organism, would make sense that it's at least able to predict with decent accuracy where the lightning bolt is going to strike. And I'm not an expert in this field, so I can't say for sure what all factors go into figuring out where a lightning bolt is going to strike. But I would imagine that the cloud would be able to figure that out over its lifetime of doing this, using experimental data to figure this out and everything. Would probably have a brain that is wired to understand it better than we do. Our body works with electrical signals. Would make sense that it would send a small electrical signal out first. If it immediately afterwards sent a lightning bolt, would probably follow the same path. Would probably be able to figure out where it's going to land by that. So even if it can't necessarily choose, it would at least know where it's going to land. In which case, it could then choose whether or not to send the lightning strike. So basically, yeah, I would believe it if it told me that, which is kind of the opposite of what he's trying to prove here. So it kind of feels kind of funny. Again, none of this is actually relevant to the topic. I just thought it was kind of interesting. Let's continue.
This analogy isn't perfect, of course. Lightning isn't truly random. It strikes in some parts of the world more than others, and it strikes certain objects more than others. Lightning is constrained to the conditions of the atmosphere, the cloud, of electromagnetism, etc. But your brain is similarly constrained. You may not ever have thoughts or intentions outside that which a kilogram of interconnected water meat inside a silent simian's skull could physically produce. But within the range of electric potential your brain can have, if you pay attention, thoughts, ideas, intentions, and actions just appear like lightning. Human brains are more complicated than thunderstorms, maybe the most complicated volumes in the universe. But you have no more reason to think that a brain has free will than that brilliant flicker of lightning does, sparkling in the dark cloud in the distance. You might now be thinking about decisions like self-improvement. What's the point? Well, I just happen to have the kind of brain that will still recommend it to you.
First, I want to reiterate how he's talking about mostly thoughts and the brain. Our brain's thoughts are heavily influenced by the rest of our body as well. Things like different levels of different chemicals that are produced in different parts of our bodies. Take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. Due to my own mental issues, especially over the past few years, I've looked into a lot of like psychology, and there's a lot going on there. And again, even outside of that, there's a lot of things that we learn to do reflexively just because we aren't always exercising free will in these decisions. Like there's a lot of decisions that we don't really feel matter at the time, or we're just going to do whatever comes to our mind first, just whatever's easiest. In which case, our decisions are controlled by our thoughts and by our brain and all our biology and everything he's talking about here. But there are definitely times where, despite our initial thoughts on things, we'll still take a different direction. Now, again, you could certainly argue that that is still the same thing. It's just a level higher or lower, depending on which way you're going. It's still all the same stuff, but we aren't truly free about it. Like, it's just a matter of what we've experienced and what we've learned, because I have learned more about these psychological processes and the way we think. Is that why I'm capable of making decisions that go against what my brain initial thoughts are? Probably yes. But this is where things get very complicated. For the most part, what he is saying all makes perfect sense. There's a lot here where everything is a collection of your biology, the thoughts you've had in the past, the information you've gathered, how you've gathered that, all the different things going on in your body and brain that are causing these different chemical reactions, what's causing the thoughts you're having, you're choosing to follow those thoughts or go against them is still part of what's going on inside of you. Very important to point out there's a lot more to a person than just the brain, and there's a lot more to your decisions than just your thoughts to be
on
about
me.
the end.
I don't think I'm ever gonna stop using this app, to be honest. It's that good. Hey, everyone can train, but not everyone knows how to train well. That's train well. Elongate yourself along the x-axis.
If it's true that we don't have free will, it's simultaneously true that we all feel like we do. I haven't believed in free will for a long time, but I would never deny that it feels like I make choices. For the sake of continuing a casual conversation, I'd say that I decided to write this video. I too labor under the illusion. I can hold this discrepancy in my mind because an intuitive belief in free will appears to be hardwired. Biologists like Roy F. Baumeister and his colleagues have argued that the feeling of a free will has been evolutionarily beneficial to us as highly social primates. When we feel responsible for our thoughts and actions, and hold our fellow humans accountable for theirs, group cooperation and rule following and norm maintenance becomes possible. Whether free will is true or not, Baumeister says, having a strong intuitive belief in it would seem to facilitate social harmony, and the cognitive capacities necessary for it seem to be likely evolutionary adaptations to aid in group cooperation. The feeling of free will is hard to shake because it's your default state. Evolution wove the feeling into your DNA. But it's not that hard to find times when we clearly don't feel free, when we seem hopelessly compelled by completely random thoughts and actions.
And I, again, think this is an important point as well, that in the end, it doesn't really matter whether free will exists or not. Again, is why I'm not necessarily trying to prove or disprove it here. I just want to facilitate the discussion more. Regardless, we're going to, as a species, continue to believe in it, which is probably important. He's sort of trying to make the point that if we accept that people aren't free, we can forgive people for their actions more easily. So I'd also argue that there would be some people who would have the opposite reaction. So it's a bit muddy there. But there's definitely a lot of things where people strongly believe something, and there's just no possible way to convince them otherwise, regardless of what data you have. The idea of free will is very much so interwoven into our way of thinking. So there's a lot of things where we believe something to be a certain way that doesn't make it the case. Gravity, for instance, is one thing where our intuition about it is so far off from our current understanding.
The example of cravings. I don't know about you, but sometimes I just need fast food. I don't know what lack of nutrients or dopamine or both caused this specific craving, but I know I'm gonna get a cheeseburger and fries today. I might not know when or where from, but I've already given myself up to that decision. Pregnant women are famously subject to the whim of cravings. We might be able to say that biologically, requests for odd foods at odd times could be driven by what the mother and fetus need nutritionally, but why pickles at 5 a.m.? Why not pickled chips at 12 p.m.? It's a silly example with larger implications. Like you thinking of Dublin and not Cairo in our experiment, there are many times when we can't consciously account for what we want and what we choose. Feeling decidedly
And so, once again, he's pointing out the idea of cravings, things where you decide to give in to your thoughts and feelings, which are instances of not exercising your free will, not instances of not having free will. Now, as we're going to get into in a minute here, there are definitely times where it becomes more and more difficult to do that. And you could certainly argue that there are times where thoughts or cravings or whatever are so strong that you couldn't possibly go against them, or at least you can for a while and eventually hit a point where you no longer can. But again, the existence of these exception that proves the rule situation here, where most of the time, even if we have a craving, we can choose whether we're going to give into it or not. The craving itself is not the absence of free will. It's the choosing whether or not to give into it that is where free will would reside, assuming, again, free will exists. Yeah, let's keep going.
Can also be one of the most pleasurable states to be in. Take the phenomenon known as flow state, when intentions and actions happen automatically, with almost no conscious effort. Maybe you're writing a book and the words just tumble out of you in the right order. Maybe you're playing the guitar and the song you've been practicing for years effortlessly comes together. Maybe you're a gymnast executing a routine that people didn't even think was possible. Being locked in like this feels amazing. Flow is a complete, energized, enjoyable focus. No thoughts, head empty. It's only when consciousness intrudes on your flow that you pause or make a mistake. Only when you exercise your apparent free will.
As he's pointing out here, you don't always have to be using the free will. Again, whether or not you're using it doesn't prove or disprove its existence. I just want to point that out once again.
You have an innate sense of free will. It likely evolved to help foster and maintain highly social cooperative groups. It's our default state, but it's not the only one. This is obvious when we can't explain our desires, or when we revel in the joy of being fully locked in. Whether or not you feel free, then, seems to depend on factors outside of your conscious control. You are beholden to your biology. This is most obvious in the most tragic examples.
The first mass murder to unfold live in the era of mass media happened on August 1st, 1966. After killing his wife and mother earlier that day, a one Charles Whitman dressed up as a worker and ascended a clock tower at the University of Texas. After killing 3 more people, he barricaded himself on the observation deck and then started firing a footlocker full of weapons down at random people. 90 minutes later, Charles Whitman was killed by police. 14 people were dead, 31 wounded. Whitman's suicide note read as follows: "I don't quite understand what it is that compels me to type this letter. I don't really understand myself these days. I am supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts." The note went on to request an autopsy after he was killed. "I never could quite make it. These thoughts are too much for me," Whitman wrote. The next day, an autopsy revealed a pecan-sized brain tumor pushing on Whitman's amygdala. This tragic story was unbelievable at the time. Today, it's commonplace. All too many examples of deformations of the brain leading to unthinkable behavior, unprecedented behavior, unfree behavior. Most people would say that these heinous acts weren't the men's fault. They were victims of biology. But when biology is all there is, where is there room for any inner working of the brain to not be attributable to circumstances that no one controls? Are you not also the victim of the brain you just happen to have? Aren't you just lucky enough that you don't have overwhelming psychotic delusions? We already tend to view other intelligent...
Okay, before we get into the next part, I want to cover this a little bit more. We're going back to that same point of the thoughts versus actions. So it is an interesting thought experiment here of whether or not, with some psychological help, someone in that state could learn to control their urges. That I don't know. It's definitely more of a medical issue that needs to be taken care of rather than a psychological one. If free will exists and is something to do with our biology, then it would also make sense that just with anything else, it would be able to malfunction. The existence of someone who physically cannot control their urges does not necessarily mean that there is no free will. In fact, the fact that most of us can control our urges, at least to some extent, again, this is something where it's definitely a learned behavior that is a lot easier to do the more you understand it, and as you actually put in the effort, think more about your thoughts, it's a lot easier to control your actions regardless of your thoughts. There certainly are disorders and medical conditions that can result in it being at least a lot more difficult, if not impossible, to control. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no free will. Because again, the fact that we are able to see these irrational thoughts as irrational and ignore them could easily be used as evidence, the opposite of what he's trying to point out here. Yeah, I want to watch the next bit. I have more to say on subjects he's going to get into that are kind of similar.
Mammals this way, beholden to biology. As silly as it sounds, I have the intuition from memes like Harambe that most of you don't want a wild animal shot and killed for what comes to it naturally. Poles find the same. If a gorilla attacks you, or a shark bites you, or a bear mauls you, is it really the animal's personal, moral fault? Again, I think most of you would say no. Isn't the deadly animal just like the man with a brain tumor? A bear simply has a bear's brain, right? And does what a bear does. On October 5th, 2003, documentary filmmaker Timothy Treadwell was killed and almost fully eaten by a brown bear, as was his girlfriend. 6 minutes of the attack was captured on audio and featured in the 2005 documentary film Grizzly Man by Werner Herzog. Treadwell was an environmentalist and founder of a bear protection organization. Of course, this didn't matter to the bears. Unlike Harambe, sympathy for Treadwell is hard to find. It's a tragic story, especially combined with the legitimately disturbing testimony from Werner Herzog, who for some reason decided to listen to Timothy being eaten alive. But it's not a surprising story.
Truly, you must never listen to this.
Bears are victims of their biology, and no matter how much you love them or advocate for them or spend time with them, eventually, they will be bears. We understand the wildness of other animals intuitively, so much so that we will even go back to work with them after losing an arm, or almost losing a life. We justify this because we know it's not the animal's fault. The point of all of this is to say that it's not your fault either. We understand that a person isn't free when there's a tumor pressing on some critical part of their brain, just as we understand the actions of a tiger or bear. But the normal structure and function of your brain, neither of which you chose or decided, is as determinant of your choices as a brain tumor is. Completely. We are victims of biology all.
Okay. So here's the next big assumption that he's making, which is that other animals must not have free will. Because once you've made this assumption, it's pretty easy to disprove free will in humans as well. So all you have to do is prove that humans aren't special among animals, which again is very much so just a human-centric way of thinking, that there's something special about humans that makes us what we are. Really, when you look at it from similar perspective to what he's doing here about all the biology and such, humans are just animals. We try harder to ignore our instincts and do things differently, thinking that that makes us better. That doesn't mean that other animals can't do that, just they don't have as much a reason to. Maybe there is something there that makes us a bit different, maybe not. Maybe there is no free will at all. Maybe all animals have it. Maybe some do, some don't. It's hard to say. But regardless, it is still an assumption here. I think it's also important to point out that when we're looking at other animals, it's not necessarily the fact that they don't have free will that's making us be wary of them. A bear isn't like guaranteed to attack us if we act in a certain way. It's that we have no way to communicate with the bear, which makes it impossible to predict when it will or won't attack. I think that's an important distinction to make there as well. Human and wild animal interactions here, we will put the blame on the human there, because if a human and wild animal come in contact with each other, the human had more choice over whether they did or not than the animal did. If a wild grizzly bear happens to break into your suburban home and eat you, probably not your fault, because that's not a scenario that's likely to happen. Now, granted, in this case, in order for that to happen, there would almost certainly be some other human involvement because it's highly unlikely for the bear to do this of its own accord. It's different than meeting a bear out on a mountain trail where there are signs out there saying, hey, there are bears here. You might want to be careful. Because again, in that case, the human understood the danger, went there, and happened to be attacked by a bear. Another human may have gone by, seen a bear, and not been attacked. The way the bear came to the decision of whether or not to attack is more difficult to figure out than it would be with humans who lack the ability to communicate effectively with these animals. Saying whether or not it's based on free will, like whether their instinct is always to act in a certain way, and some do, some don't. So difficult to say, but it's still important to note that it is absolutely an assumption to say that other animals do not have free will, independent of whether or not humans do. It's still a matter of exercising free will, even if they do have the ability to see their thoughts and choose whether or not to act on them. Out in the wild, for any animal, human included, it makes a lot more sense to act based on instinct rather than rational thought. The times when you're going to use instinctual thoughts are times where you don't have a lot of time to think, which means the percentage of the time where acting on instinct in this situation is going to result in you living a lot more than the time where taking the extra time to think it through would benefit you instead. Whether or not the animals are conscious of this, it's still a learned behavior here. Whether free will does or does not exist, it's still worth considering these points here and acknowledging when we're making an assumption. Because it's a whole lot easier to prove that humans can't have free will if no other animal does.
Without free will, or in accepting its non-existence, it's often claimed that the world will turn to chaos, that people will turn into nothing better than barbarians. If no one is truly accountable for their actions, how can we feel morally justified in punishing them for what they do? I agree. How could we feel that way?
Returning to the evolutionary view, it makes sense that we want people to be punished. It arguably helps highly social animals like us enforce norms and rules and maintain the group. But if you're not responsible for your actions, as I claim, does it make sense to physically or mentally harm societal transgressors? There doesn't seem to be anything morally incorrect about separating harmful members of society from the rest of us. If they are unfortunate enough to be psychopaths, you wouldn't want them around your family or your community. And a physical barrier like a jail cell is as sensible as a barrier between a grizzly bear and the children at the zoo. It does seem morally incorrect, however, to want to inflict physical pain, in the case of the death penalty, and or mental anguish, in the case of solitary confinement, on a person who is simply unlucky enough to have the brain that they do, to have the desires and the delusions and dangerous intentions that they do, through no fault of their own. The non-existence of free will doesn't appear to immediately lead to the total collapse of our legal system, which is fundamentally based on the freedom of will, as many claim. In fact, acknowledging the reality of the human brain may in fact benefit the industrial punishment apparatus. Moral progress is already being made on death row, in solitary confinement, and on other punishments that feel cruel and all too usual. The only thing that is stopping us from extending this progress from the most heinous crimes all the way down to the most basic misdemeanors is the illusion that every person is directly and personally and morally responsible for every thought they could possibly have and every action they could possibly take. Nature versus nurture is an outdated idea. Modern biology knows that it's both. It matters what your genes are, but it also matters where you buy your genes from, how your neurons are connected and how you connect with your parents. how your cells run your genetic code, and what kind of friends you run with. If brain tumors and growing up in bad areas are both completely understandable reasons why someone's behavior is determined, if it makes sense not to cuddle with grizzly bears, there is no logical reason for us not to extend this determinism to all behaviors and all actions. Nature has nurtured you, hopefully more positively, in the exact same way. You are simply lucky enough to be you.
Okay, and here I just want to point out that I absolutely agree with him here, that regardless of whether free will exists or not, having laws and such, that all definitely needs to be a thing. Now, I would point out that a lot of the problems end up being societal ones, where our society and all societies on our planet have a lot of issues that need to be worked out. If free will is a thing, having better education to help people understand their choices and how to choose would be helpful. If free will isn't a thing, then still having environments set up to facilitate proper learning, to get people into the proper headspace for their decisions to be better for society still makes sense. So either way, it's definitely a societal thing, and regardless of free will existing or not, all of his points very valid there. Let's get back to the video.
Some philosophers, like the late Dan Dennett, have pointed out places where free will could still be hiding in a deterministic universe. It's a simple fact that you, as an organism, make decisions. You decide to go to the gym, to prefer chocolate to vanilla, to say GIF instead of GIF, even though one of those is incorrect. This is true, but this isn't free will as it's being argued against.
I'd also like to point out there, real quick, that he mentioned 3 decisions, but 2 of them were a decision. The other one was more of a feeling or thought, that you do decide to go to the gym, you do decide how to pronounce your words. To an extent, some of it is kind of based off of your instinct. Like once you get to a point of saying something enough, you'll just automatically say it that way. But you still, at some point, generally will make a decision. As long as someone points out another option, you will decide between them. Preferring chocolate versus vanilla is very much so. That's not something you ever decide. It just is. How your brain works, your taste buds, all that. Something in your body just tells you, like, yeah, I like this one more than this one. You don't get to decide what you prefer. Yeah, I just want to point that out.
A beetle, too, decides to crawl over the twig instead of underneath it. The difference is that we feel that we have the conscious ability to choose our choices. This feeling is an illusion, for all the reasons that we've gone through. Could free will be hiding in some of the more mysterious spots in science? What about quantum mechanics? Well, I don't think there's any room for freedom here either. Even if it does turn out that quantum randomness is critical to consciousness, you have no more control over these probabilistic outcomes than you have control over the results of God's tumbling dice. Even the experiments that prove free will doesn't exist aren't really important to the basic causal argument.
Here's where we get into quantum mechanics. To my understanding, even the experts on the subject only know so much. It's one of those things where what we see in pop culture is surface level, or even just completely incorrect, or based off of old understanding. But I still think it's worth noting that he is making an assumption here that it doesn't play a part in free will. I'm going to get into some sort of crackpot speculation here, but I personally think it's fun and interesting. My purpose here isn't to prove any point. It's just to foster more discussion. And so I do think that these crazy thoughts will help in that regard. So the assumption he's making is that we have no control over quantum randomness and such, In all likelihood, that is correct. But it is still an assumption based on the way we think about the universe, which again, the way we think about the universe is that we have free will. In order for this to all be correct, our understanding of the universe must be in some ways incorrect, which I mean, we also know is the case in things like, again, like I believe I mentioned earlier, the way we understand gravity, which we will get into here, because we always think of ourselves as being three-dimensional beings, and we understand that there is a fourth dimension of time beyond the three dimensions of space. We are constantly moving through that dimension as well as the other three. We are always moving through time. People like to point out that we are more limited in that regard, in that we are only able to move in one direction through time at more or less a constant rate. But if we look at the dimensions of space as well, if we look at the dimension that is parallel to gravity, we can't really move in that direction freely either. Like we can jump, we could climb up something, but the saying goes, what goes up must come down. We're not truly free to move in that dimension either. The reason is because of the same force that is forcing us to move through time in a specific way as well, that being gravity. I'm not an expert in this field, so I'm not going to try to explain my understanding of relativity or anything. Like, sure, we have created ways of moving more easily through that third spatial dimension, planes and rockets and such, but they do so mostly by increasing velocity, which, funny enough, is also the way to change the rate at which we move through time. It would make sense to either say we are four-dimensional or two-dimensional, more so than three-dimensional. Even if you look at our sight, it is based in two dimensions. Our sight is based on having two overlaying two-dimensional representations of our surroundings, which our mind is able to interpret as a three-dimensional image. Are we even three-dimensional beings? Most things happen either in two or four dimensions, despite I would also argue that nothing really exists in two spatial dimensions, with the exception being our sight, interestingly enough, in that it is a projection. But that's also actually light, which is either three-dimensional or zero-dimensional, I would say. Again, not an expert, so you'd have to have someone who knows more about this to really decide. I would claim that we truly are four-dimensional beings. Instinctually, we don't need to worry about being four-dimensional. Like the fourth dimension just kind of happens naturally. We don't have to do anything to move through it. But it's also worth noting we do have a, sense of time, as we say. It's kind of funny that we always like to claim we have five senses, but there's definitely more than that. I feel like we as a society have sort of realized that there's more. The understanding that touch is actually sense of touch, sense of temperature, and sense of pain. We claim to have a sense of time. We have a circadian rhythm, which is not necessarily what we're referring to as our sense of time. But despite understanding that well enough to call it that, we never really think of it as a sense. But again, if we are four-dimensional beings, despite not necessarily acknowledging or understanding that, then who's to say we aren't actually five-dimensional or more than that? I believe I remember hearing at some point something about like 11 dimensions we understand in total, but I don't know that for sure. And I don't remember where I even heard this, so I wouldn't call this anything worth keeping in mind. But I imagine that quantum mechanics would be considered one of these dimensions. I tend to call it the fifth dimension because I don't know what else would be in between that and time. My understanding is it's kind of like the so-called many worlds theory. People tend to not like to talk about this too much because there's so many science fiction takes on this in which they either oversimplify it or use it as an opportunity to just, tell a story in which the characters exist in a different way. I'm not really sure what all exhibits quantum mechanics. I believe electrons do. I imagine anything that small does. They exist sort of in a quantum flux, I guess you would call it, where they have a wave-like behavior, but then have a particle-like behavior once observed, or once the quantum state is set, so to speak. Again, my terminology here could be very wrong. Would not use any of what I'm saying as any sort of proof of anything. If you have your three-dimensional space, and that exists in a line along the time axis, so the three-dimensional space at each point in time, then you could have a plane in the quantum dimension. Again, we're calling the fifth dimension. The numbering system doesn't really matter here. At each point along the timeline, each particle could exist in a different point here along the fifth dimensional axis. And we usually, in fiction at least, tend to think of each line here as being parallel to one another. But there's no reason to believe that they can't move along the fifth dimension as well as the other dimensions. And that doesn't mean by any means that our brains have the ability to influence this at all. But I do think it's interesting and worth bringing up, even if it is complete, utter nonsense, which is more likely than not, given that I, again, know nothing on the subject. But it still makes for fun discussion. And yeah, so let's finish up the video. There's a little bit more here before we get to the end.
It's been shown, for example, that if you lay a human down in an fMRI and ask them to click a button when they first feel an inkling of a decision on some simple task, there is some unconscious brain activity recorded that precedes the button press. This has been interpreted in the popular media as the brain deciding before the conscious self decides, thereby showing that the feeling of free will is just that, a feeling. These experiments are often used as the ammunition by unbelievers in the free will debate, but in truth, they are a red herring. Even if they demonstrated the opposite, no significant brain activity before a person reports themselves consciously aware of deciding, it still wouldn't show how someone decided to decide. No matter when and where the fMRI flares up, inserting free will into the colorful activity on screen always creates a problem of infinite regress. If you decided, when did you decide to start deciding? When did you choose to choose to choose? Unlike the great causal chain, these links lead back to nothing. For free will to exist, in the way that we feel like it does, requires more than fancy philosophy or quantum mechanics. You would need a truly separate entity, unlinked from the great causal chain, that was in no way a product of nature or nurture, something that could decide before decisions were made, and think of thoughts never thunk. In our current understanding of the physical universe, we have no reason to believe that such a homunculus exists, or could exist. Our naive dualism and evolved sense of self makes it feel like it could. But I think if you engage honestly with everything we've gone through so far and pay attention to your own brain, that feeling fades away, if it doesn't totally disappear. This argument is usually framed as losing something, if it's indeed an illusion, as I claim. But I believe you can gain from losing free will. It has made me a more compassionate person, both to myself and to others. If I am but a historian of my feelings and intentions and actions, how can I really get lost in regret? I happen to be the kind of organism that did the things that I did. I no longer assault my psyche with what could have been. And truthfully, I have used this revelation to ease many painful events in my life. I believe I'm a kinder person to myself. Of course, I just also happen to be the kind of person that considered this argument and changed as a result, and told others about it. Losing free will has also made me more compassionate for other people that I otherwise wouldn't have any compassion for. How can I hate the murderer, or the abuser, or the criminal for simply being unlucky enough to be them? I can and absolutely do think they should be separated from society depending on their crimes, but I'd also say the same thing about sharks and beaches. To me, it doesn't make moral sense to inflict physical and mental harm and anguish and torture on these unfortunate people, no more than it makes sense to shoot the gorilla, who has a natural curiosity towards small gorilla-shaped objects that fall into its enclosure. Losing free will in this way forces compassion in uncomfortable places, places where often the most moral growth is needed.
In the end, I'd be the first person to admit that whether or not we have free will, it doesn't really matter. The illusion is strong enough, even in unbelievers like me, that I don't think it would make a dent outside of academia if I produced a mathematical proof of its non-existence. Still, if it's the pursuit of truth that we're ultimately after in science, then that truth is worth pursuing and trying to come to terms with, no matter how unintuitive and mentally destabilizing it may be. Of course, whether or not any of this will land with you isn't for me to decide. Or you, for that matter. Until next time.
Okay, that's basically the end of the video. I do think, again, most of what he's saying there, I completely agree with. Realistically, doesn't really matter whether or not free will exists. The way we think about it isn't going to change because of that. I'm not sure that I agree with his way of defining what free will is. Because he's saying basically that there would have to be a separate entity making the decisions, which I'm not sure makes sense to me, because separating the self from yourself may kind of be going in the same direction that I am, but kind of going about it the opposite way, where he's trying to say that you have to be separate from the brain, while I'm saying we have to kind of combine everything together. I also want to point out about he has found for himself, thinking about things in this manner has helped with the way he sees criminals and such. I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but I imagine that while a lot of people would think the same way as him if they decided to no longer believe in free will, that there'd be a lot of people who feel the opposite way as well. I found personally for myself that I arrived at a similar conclusion there by realizing the flaws of society as being the main driving force for a lot of crime. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that this isn't the only way to get to that point. And I think each individual has their own need for what would get them there, because the whole thing here ends up not mattering in the end, which I, again, 100% agree with him on there. It sort of makes defining it kind of pointless for the sake of philosophical argument and understanding things better. It is kind of worth going back to. I was talking about at the very beginning here with the two extremes. Like, I don't think that either extreme is the case. That the universe is entirely deterministic, that everything is predetermined. There's only one possible way everything could have happened from the beginning of time till now. And I don't think that every single action is based on a free will choice either, which means that our definition of free will has to be flexible enough to fit somewhere in the middle, which also means that there's a lot more gray space than black and white, so to speak. I will say that I do still believe it exists because I believe that we all have the ability to make decisions. We can choose things, we can grow, we can become better people, we can become a better society. All the things that are wrong can all be fixed. Is that all possible without free will? Probably. It's just a difference of what can happen versus what will happen. The interesting point is that, like he was saying, with, I don't want to say decision because that sort of undermines his point, but his understanding that free will doesn't exist has led to his personal growth. So I do believe that for some people that would be the case, believing that there is no free will, that people won't choose something new, which again isn't necessarily the case either, that a new choice won't be made just because it. This is why the definition of free will is so difficult here. If we can show that free will doesn't exist despite new choices being made every day, things that have never been chosen before, what can we define as free will? Very possible that people believing there is no free will would push them towards trying to make the world better, just an understanding that things are unlikely to change because people are more likely than not going to continue to make similar decisions to what they have in the past. I honestly would argue that that is a good point towards the existence of free will. Just the fact that we not only can, but frequently do make decisions of new choices, things that have never been done before, which is why society continues to move forward. That there are constantly new things being created, things that never existed before.